The thing about dying cold was that you did it quietly. Mara had learned this before she could walk, watching the other newborns in the pen where they kept the unassigned young, watching the ones who cried too much go still by morning. The nurses didn't come for the small ones unless they made noise, and the small ones who made too much noise didn't last. So you learned, somewhere in the wordless architecture of your first weeks of life, that silence was a kind of armor, and cold was just another thing you carried. She was Orc nominally, green-skinned by blood, but the blood was thin. Her mother had been a half-breed, something the clan tattoo records noted with a small slash mark that meant impure, diluted, less. Her father was unknown, or rather, unrecorded, which in the Vorech clan's meticulous genealogy amounted to the same thing. She had been placed in the unassigned pen with 11 others before her 3rd day of life. By her 30th day, she was the only one left. She was not especially strong, not especially large. Her tusks, when they finally came in around her 4th year, were slightly asymmetrical. The left one sat a centimeter higher than the right, a cosmetic flaw the clan elders had noted in her growth ledger with the same small slash mark. Impure, diluted, less. But she was quiet, and she was fast, and she had learned before she could speak that the world would not give you anything it could keep for itself. The colony station Kesavar 7 hung in the outer belt of the Thurvian system like a lantern someone had forgotten to extinguish. It had been a human research post once, before the Conquered, before the Great Survey pulled every human flag back to the inner systems and left the outer territories to the species who claimed them. Now it was a way station, a place of traders, indentured labor pools, and the kind of quiet desperation that didn't put itself on forms. Mara had come here at age 9, traded between clan handlers until she ended up in the service of a labor broker named Durst, who was large and slow, and not cruel in any specific way, but cruel in the general, ambient way of people who simply don't think of you as a person. Durst ran a small gang of juvenile theft runners, children nimble enough to slip through service corridors, quick enough to be 3 junctions away before the mark understood what had happened. He'd had them long enough that he no longer thought about them much. They were tools. You didn't think about your tools. Mara had been running lifts for 2 years when the purifiers came. She heard about them the way you heard about everything important on Kesavar 7, not through official channels, not through the station broadcasts that ran on a 40-hour loop of trade updates and conquered weather data, but through the low murmur of people in corridors, in the gaps between sleep shifts, in the particular quality of silence that fell over a room when someone entered it wearing a face that had seen something. The purifiers were Sarathi. This much she knew. Everyone knew what Sarathi looked like. Tall, bilaterally symmetrical in a way that human xenobiologists had found unsettling before they stopped publishing xenobiology papers, their exoskeletons shifting color with their emotional states the way a human face shifted expression. When they were calm, they were the pale gray of old bone. When they were something else, something Mara had no word for yet, they went to a deep amber that was almost beautiful until you understood what it meant. The Sarathi had been surveying the outer belt systems for 3 cycles. That was the official story. The truth, which moved faster than the official story, as truth generally did, was that they were classifying. They had developed in the century since the Conquered an elaborate biological theology, the idea that the great project of a civilized galaxy was the elimination of contamination. Not a word they said aloud in Conquered sessions. In Conquered sessions, they used words like optimization and genetic coherence and population health management. But on Kesavar 7, in the corridors and the cargo bays and the crowded dormitory blocks where the labor bonded slept in shifts, people used the plain word. Purification. The first one Mara ever saw up close was standing at the entrance to Durst's level when she came back from a run with a stolen data chip tucked under her tongue. He was enormous. The exoskeleton was full amber, which she didn't know yet, and he was flanked by two conquered compliance officers who were working very hard at looking at anything except the Sarathi beside them. Durst was speaking to him. Durst was using his transaction voice, the voice he used when he wanted something to not be a problem, smooth and self-effacing and offering things before they were asked for. Mara watched from 3 corridors away, pressed flat against a junction wall, and she watched the Sarathi's head turn, not the whole head, just the upper sensory cluster, rotating independently the way a bird's head rotated. And she understood, in the wordless architecture that had kept her alive since her 30th day of life, that she should not be seen. She was back in the service tunnels before the Sarathi finished turning. His name, she learned later, was Assessor Keth, which was a title more than a name. The Sarathi didn't distinguish much between the two. He had been assigned to Kesavar 7 as part of the Thurvian Sector Survey, which was what the conquered compliance forms called it. What Assessor Keth called it, in the private records she would eventually read years later, was a culling audit. His theology was not complicated. It had the terrible simplicity of all sincere beliefs. The galaxy was, in Assessor Keth's understanding, a body, and a body required maintenance. Not cruelty, he would have been offended by the word. What he did was not cruel. What he did was clinical. He had been doing it for 40 years, station by station, labor pool by labor pool, and he slept well at the end of each survey, the amber fading from his exoskeleton to the pale gray of a thing that had completed its work. He had a family somewhere in the inner Sarathi systems. He thought about them with the warm, practical affection of a person who has arranged his life into neat compartments. He stood at the entrance to Durst's level and he told Durst, in the calm, measured conquered standard that all assessors used, that he would need access to the labor pool records. All of them. Full biometric files, genetic lineage documentation where available, and current productivity assessments. Durst had given him everything before the sentence was finished. Mara, 3 corridors away, and already moving through a service tunnel that she was fairly sure no adult could fit through, heard none of this. But she was back within the hour, crouched in a ventilation shaft above Durst's main office, watching through a grating the width of 2 fingers as Assessor Keth reviewed the files spread across the display surface. He reviewed them the way a jeweler reviews stones, methodical, patient, making small marks in a personal log she couldn't read from her angle. When he came to her file, he stopped for slightly longer than the others. She watched his exoskeleton shift, just at the neck, a faint darkening almost imperceptible toward amber. She didn't breathe. He moved on. But she had seen the mark he made beside her file, and she had spent enough of her life reading the small slash marks in ledgers to understand what that particular shape meant. She dropped out of the ventilation shaft the moment he left, walked to Durst's display surface with the unhurried calm of someone with full authorization, pulled up her own file, read the mark beside her name, and understood that she had perhaps 3 days. She stood there for a moment in the empty office, with the hum of the ventilation system and the faint glow of the display surface and the smell of machine oil and Durst's cheap transit-grade coffee. She had known, in a wordless way, for 2 days, since she'd first seen him at the entrance to the level. The mark in the ledger only put a number on what the body already knew. 3 days was a specific thing. It was the difference between a problem and a fact. She turned off the display surface, replaced it exactly as she'd found it, and left. There was a third party she had not accounted for. His name was Stanek, and he ran the station's medical-adjacent services, the kind that existed in the gap between official health care and the needs of a labor-bonded population that couldn't afford official health care. He was Concord registered, which meant he was technically neutral, which meant in practice that he had relationships with everyone and commitments to no one, which was a kind of freedom that Mara had never had access to and viewed with a mixture of respect and suspicion. He found her in the food hall on the second day, sliding into the seat across from her with the practiced ease of someone who had learned that sitting down first made conversations feel less like ambushes. She had seen him twice before. Once at a distance when one of the other runners had needed a dislocated shoulder reset. Once across a corridor when he'd been walking with a conquered compliance officer, and they'd both been performing the careful neutrality of people in a conversation. They wanted to exist in the record differently than it was actually occurring. He was human, slight, with the careful eyes of someone who assessed rooms before he entered them fully. He had a medical diagnostic stylus in his hands, modified, she noted, slightly heavier than standard issue. He turned it over the way Seth turned his wire. Not nervously, just continuously, the habit of hands that needed to be in contact with something. "I know what you took from the relay junction," he said, quietly. The way medical people said difficult things, not to soften them but to control their radius. "Then you know more than I do," she said. "I haven't finished deciding what to do with it." "I think you have," he said. He looked at her with the particular quality of attention she'd learned to recognize in people who weren't going to leave after the first sentence. "I've been here 11 years. I've watched 3 audit cycles come through Kesavar 7. First 2, I told myself the same thing everyone tells themselves." He paused. The stylus rotated in his fingers. That there were protections, that the conquered processes meant something, that a sufficiently large institution couldn't, he stopped again, set the stylus on the table. "The 3rd cycle, I stopped telling myself that." Mara said nothing. She had found over the years that silence was better than sympathy when people were navigating towards something they needed to say. "I have records," he said, "medical records, biometric baseline data collected under conquered health protocols, which puts them in a different legal category than the assessor's survey processing files, harder to suppress in a court challenge." He met her eyes. "If what you're building includes biometric baseline data from the flagged population, the filing isn't just a procedural challenge. It becomes evidentiary, the kind of evidence that requires a formal response rather than a dismissal." Mara looked at him. "Why now?" she said. 3 cycles." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Last cycle I told a 14-year-old she was going to be fine." He picked the stylus back up. "She had been in my care for 6 months. She had a name I knew." He looked at the stylus. "I was wrong. I would rather be less wrong this time." She understood. She did not say she understood because that wasn't what the moment needed. "Can you get the files to a secure relay by tonight?" "Yes." "Don't give me the relay address. Find the human who's been on the cargo levels for 2 days. You know who I mean, and give it to him." He did know. Of course he did. 11 years. She stood. "One more thing." She set Durst's handwritten names on the table between them. "The 3 compliance officers. Do you know which contacts they have in the sector court relay office?" He looked at the paper. He looked at her. "You're 12 years old," he said. "Yes," she took the paper back. "And you're going to tell me anyway." He told her. The first person she told was Seth. Seth was 11 and had been running for Durst longer than Mara. He was human, which mattered in ways that were not discussed openly but were felt continuously. Human labor bonded had different paperwork, different conquered classifications, different leverage points in the accounting of what they were worth. Seth had a sister somewhere in the inner systems, a name on a forwarding address he'd been writing letters to since he was 7, and he had the particular quality of stubborn cheerfulness that people developed when they had decided, for no reason that logic could support, that things were going to work out. Mara found him in the cramped shared bunk they'd been assigned for the current sleep shift cycle, sitting cross-legged on his mat with a piece of wire he was attempting to shape into something. He looked up when she came in. He had the kind of face that registered information without performing a reaction first. She told him what she'd seen. She told him about the mark. He was quiet for a long time. He turned the wire over in his fingers. He'll get to me eventually, he said. Not a question. Your classification is different. Not that different. He set the wire down. How many others? She had counted. There were 7 juveniles in Durst's pool, 3 human, 4 orc including Mara. Of the 4 orcs, 2 were full-blood Vorech clan with clean lineage records. 1 was a halfling like Mara, though male, with a different set of slash marks. Mara had the worst record on paper. He'll start with me, she said. So we don't let him start. Seth said it with the same tone he used for everything, as though the problem were simply a question of sequencing. We find something, we use it. Use what? He picked the wire back up. He's here officially. Official means paperwork. Paperwork means he needs the station infrastructure to process whatever he's doing. If we can find where the processing goes. He shaped the wire into a small loop, looked at it, reshaped it. Compliance records, whatever he's filing, there's leverage in that, if we can get to it. Mara looked at him. You think like a thief. I've been a thief since I was 8. He held up the wire. It was, she realized, not a random shape. It was a skeleton key, the old-fashioned kind, for the particular locking mechanism on the restricted cargo level 3 decks below. She hadn't told him she'd been planning to go there. She hadn't told him anything yet. She took it from him. Come on, she said. The restricted cargo level smelled like machine oil and old fear, which was the smell of most administrative spaces on Kesevar 7 when you stripped away whatever they were performing on the surface. Mara moved through it the way she moved through everything, low, quiet, her asymmetrical tusks a faint weight at the corners of her jaw, her breathing timed to the cycling of the ventilation systems. She found the assessor's field station in the 3rd cargo bay from the East Junction. It was a standard Sarathi mobile processing unit, self-contained, armored in that particular bureaucratic way of things that had been designed to survive audits. It was also, she noted with the professional eye of someone who had been bypassing security systems since she was 10, connected to the station's main data relay through a physical hardline that ran along the south wall and disappeared into a junction box that someone had helpfully labeled in Concord Standard. Auxiliary relay, authorized access only. Mara had been through that junction box twice last cycle, running lift routes. She knew exactly which panel came loose if you pressed it at the lower left corner. She was inside the hardline access point in 4 minutes. What she found was not the leverage Seth had theorized. It was something larger and colder, and in some ways worse, because it was worse to understand the full dimension of a thing than to imagine it in pieces. Assessor Keth's survey was not confined to Kesevar 7. It was one of 11 concurrent audits running across the Thurvian sector. The processing data she was reading, pulling off the relay line in compressed packets she'd have to decode later, was the aggregate of all 11 stations. 342 individuals flagged in the past 6 cycles, flagged for what the forms called population health concerns. Flagged for genetic dilution, for mixed species classification, for impure lineage documentation, for the dozen small slash marks that meant the same thing in every language. Less than 342 individuals. In the past 6 cycles, she sat in the dark of the junction box with the data running through her fingers, and she understood, not for the first time, but for the first time with the full weight of evidence behind it, what she had always intuited from the ventilation shaft above Durst's office, that the mark beside her name was not about her specifically. It had never been about her specifically. It was about a category she fit, and categories didn't negotiate. She copied everything she could carry and got out. There was a man in the station's neutral zone, the commercial level, technically owned by no species' jurisdiction under Concord Treaty law, who was not what he presented himself as. She had noticed him the way she noticed everything, peripherally, without appearing to. He was human, which was unusual at Kesevar 7. Not impossible, there were always a few human traders, A few human-conquered liaisons who moved through the outer belt with the careful neutrality of people paid to not take sides. But this one moved wrong. Or rather, he moved too right. He moved with the precise, calibrated economy of someone who had trained himself to look like he wasn't trained. His name on his transit papers was Wren. He had been on the station for 2 days, which was exactly how long the assessor had been on the station, which Mara did not think was coincidental. She found him in the station's one functioning food hall, sitting alone at a corner table with a plate of something he wasn't eating and a terminal he was not obviously using. She sat down across from him without invitation, because she had spent her entire life in spaces where there was no point in waiting for invitations. He looked up. He had the face of someone who had been surprised by very little for a very long time. There was something in it she recognized from mirrors, not grief exactly, not hardness exactly, but the specific expression of a person who has arranged themselves to be durable. His jaw carried the remnants of a bruise, faded to yellow-green, maybe a week old. His hands, resting on the table, were the hands of someone who used them. "You're watching the assessor," she said. He didn't answer. "So am I." She set the data chip on the table between them, not offering it, just making a fact visible. "I have 3 days. Maybe 4 if he works through the other flagged cases in order." He looked at the chip, he looked at her. "You should leave the station," he said. His voice was quiet, calibrated, the voice of someone who chose words the way engineers chose load-bearing components. "There are freight routes. Running doesn't stop it." She tapped the chip with one finger. "He's not the only assessor. There are 11 surveys running concurrently in this sector alone. If I run, I find another station with another assessor and another set of forms with slash marks. Running is just—" She paused, looking for the word in Concord Standard that matched what she meant, and couldn't find it, so she used the Vorech clan word that meant the act of walking toward the same wall from a longer distance. "Running is stupid," she settled on. He was quiet for a long moment. He picked up the chip. Before she spoke to Wren, she went back to Durst. This was not sentimental. She had no sentimentality about Durst. He had never been a father figure, a mentor, or even a neutral presence in any meaningful way. He had been a condition she'd operated under, the way gravity was a condition. You didn't resent gravity, you just accounted for it. But Durst had files she needed access to, and Durst had a relationship with the Concord Compliance Office that she needed to understand. And Durst, crucially, had not yet been told what to do about her specifically. The assessor's audit was still in the preliminary phase, still moving through the other flagged cases in the methodical order of a man who had done this 40 times, and had learned that order was its own form of control. She found him in his office, which was less an office than a repurposed storage bay with a display surface and a chair that had been expensive once. He was reviewing his shipment manifests with the focused attention of a man who had decided, recently and firmly, that the only things worth paying attention to were the things on the manifests. "You knew," she said. He looked up. "You knew what the assessor's survey was for," she said, "before he came. You knew the last time, too, the Morven Station audit 3 cycles ago. I looked it up. You had labor bonded there before the audit. Afterward, you didn't." Durst was quiet. He was not a brave man, and he was not a coward in any active sense. He was something more diffuse and in some ways worse. A man who had arranged his ethics around practical outcomes so thoroughly that the original architecture had long since become invisible to him. He looked at her across the storage bay, and she could see him running the calculation, the one he ran every time. What was the cost? What was the benefit? What was the path of least friction? "You should leave the station," he said. "There are freight routes," she finished. "Yes. I've heard." She crossed the room and sat down in the chair across from his, because sitting made conversations harder to exit. "I need to know which compliance officers the assessor has working with him, not the ones on the official forms. the ones he's actually using. Durst looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, and she let him look, because she understood that the calculation he was running was real and had to be allowed to complete. He was weighing her against the assessor, and she was smaller and had slash marks in her file, and she watched him arrive, provisionally and with evident reluctance, at an answer she hadn't quite expected. 3 of them, he said, Bullock's team. The ones he brought in from the sector hub. He picked up his stylus and wrote 3 names on a physical note, actual paper, which told her something about how much he trusted any digital record right now, and passed it across the desk. I don't know what you think you're doing, he said. Yes, you do, she said. She took the paper and stood up. That's why you wrote it down. She left him sitting in his chair in his storage bay, looking at the manifests of a labor pool that was, she had begun to understand, about to need different management. His name was not Wren. She didn't learn his real name for several weeks, and when she did, it was less important than she'd expected. Names, she had always found, were less informative than the things people did with their hands. What she learned about him instead was assembled piecemeal, the way she assembled everything, from what was visible versus what was performed, from what he didn't say more than what he did. He had lost someone. This was clear not from anything he mentioned. He mentioned almost nothing personal, but from the particular quality of focus he brought to the work, which was the focus of someone with a debt rather than a purpose. He moved through the station's restricted levels with the ease of long practice, and the ease was not joy. Joy looked different. What he had was more like fluency in a language you'd learned out of necessity rather than love. She learned, in pieces, over the weeks that followed, that he had come from the inner systems, that he had a background in conquered documentation, legal work, the kind that required understanding how official processes could be used against the people they claimed to protect, that he had begun this work not as an investigator or an operative, but as a private person who had encountered the program's results in a specific and personal way, and who had decided that the only thing that would satisfy the debt was understanding the mechanism well enough to damage it. He didn't tell her who he had lost. She didn't ask. She understood that the question would close something that was better left open, that the specific person mattered less than the fact of the loss, and that the fact of the loss was something she recognized in herself, even if her version of it was distributed rather than pointed at a single face. You couldn't lose people you'd never had, but you could lose the idea of what you might have had, and she had been losing that in small, steady increments since before she could name it. They did not discuss this. They worked. He had been tracking Assessor Keth for 4 months. He had evidence, not the processing data Mara had pulled, which was operational but historical records, documentation of previous surveys, previous stations, previous audit cycles where the population health flags had been followed by the kind of quiet disappearances that didn't generate Concord incident reports, because the Concord infrastructure that would generate those reports had been, in the relevant jurisdictions, either looking away or actively involved. 342 in 6 cycles, Mara had calculated. He had numbers going back 40 years. They worked in the junction space between shifts, in the narrow hours when the station's noise dropped to a minimum, and the ventilation systems ran at reduced capacity. Mara's small hands moving through data relays, while the man who called himself Wren built the case around her like a structure, methodical, load-bearing, designed to hold. Seth came with them, because Seth went everywhere Mara went in those weeks, because he was 11 and stubborn, and had decided that things were going to work out. He had a gift for the kind of practical problem-solving that came from growing up in environments where problems didn't wait for you to have the right tools. When the relay access junction required a bypass they hadn't planned for, it was Seth who figured it out, working the mechanism with the bent wire and 2 fingers, and a quality of concentration that reminded Mara of something she couldn't quite name. It reminded her, she realized eventually, of herself. The first time someone had seen her and recognized something in her that was capable rather than merely surviving. The first time she had understood that survival and capability were not the same thing, and that the difference mattered. She thought about this for one night and then put it away. There wasn't time. The assessor was not a careless man. This was the thing that made him genuinely dangerous, more dangerous than a crueler or more overtly violent figure would have been. He had designed his operations to be invisible not through secrecy, but through legitimacy. Everything he did was filed, documented, processed through official channels, stamped with conquered compliance codes that gave it the appearance of routine administrative work. The genius of it, if you could call it that, was that it operated entirely within systems that most people trusted because those systems had been presented to them as protections. He knew he was being watched. Mara understood this when she came back to the ventilation shaft above Durst's office on the fourth day and found the shaft itself different, not obviously, not in any way that would register to someone who hadn't spent 2 years memorizing its exact dimensions and dust patterns, but different. A secondary sensor had been installed, well concealed, covering the grating from the office side. He had known someone was watching the first time. He had let them watch while he installed the counter-surveillance. He was, in his methodical, theological way, patient. She told Wren. He was quiet in the way he went quiet when he was recalculating. He knows we have the data, he said. He doesn't know what we'll do with it. He'll move up the timeline. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the wall, which she'd come to understand meant he was working. He has to. The value of the survey depends on completing it before a challenge can be mounted through conquered channels, if the data becomes a legal exhibit. How long does that take, filing through Concord? He told her. She did the math. That's not enough time, she said. No. They were quiet. Somewhere in the station's deep infrastructure, a pressure cycle completed, and the ventilation shifted pitch by half a tone. There's another way, Mara said. I know. You won't like it. I know. She looked at him. He looked at her. He had the expression of someone who had already made the calculation and arrived at the same answer she had, and disliked it for reasons that were more personal than strategic. It can't be you, she said. You move wrong, he's already clocked you. Yes. And Seth is too human. His documentation type, the Concord classification, the assessor won't have him on the primary list. He'll notice if Seth is in places he has no reason to be. Yes. So it's me. She said it plainly the way she said most things. I'm already on the primary list. I'm already supposed to be on his timeline. If I walk into his audit space as a subject, not a threat. He'll try to complete the processing. I know. She was quiet for a moment. I need you to be at the station beacon array. The main one at the World's Fair Pavilion, the one they lit for the survey delegation's arrival. When I signal, you file. You file everything all at once directly to the Concord Sector Court before he can suppress it. You don't wait. You don't come for me first. You file. Wren was quiet for a long time. He might complete the processing before the filing goes through, he said. He might. You understand what that means. I have understood what it means, Mara said, since I was 30 days old. He looked at her. There was something in his face she couldn't categorize. Not pity, she would have identified pity and reacted to it. Something else. The look of a person who has arranged themselves to be durable, confronted with evidence that durability can be arrived at by more than one path. If I don't file in time, he said quietly, I will not stop. I know, she said, that's why I chose you. She walked into the assessor's field station at the beginning of the third shift cycle, when the cargo level was at its lightest population, and the station's ambient noise was low. She walked in because she could not afford to be caught trying to enter secretly. She walked in the way she had walked into every difficult space since she was 9 years old, Upright, unhurried, with the quality of presence that communicated nothing unusual because she had practiced, for years, the art of being in spaces she was not supposed to be while appearing to belong there. Assessor Keth was at his processing station. He turned when she entered, the sensory cluster rotating first, independently, before the rest of his body followed. She watched his exoskeleton red amber. She had expected to be afraid. She was not. She was something quieter than afraid, something that existed on the far side of fear after you'd lived with it long enough that it became familiar. Processing record 7 Marivorach, she said. She used the case number from her file. She said it in Concord Standard with the flat affect of someone reading a form. I understand I'm scheduled for audit completion. I'm here to facilitate. He was very still. You were in the ventilation system, he said. His Concord Standard was perfect, the grammar immaculate, each word placed with the precision of a surgeon's instrument. Yes. And in the relay junction, on the restricted cargo level. Yes. You copied the survey data. Yes. She met his gaze, the complex, multifaceted optical structures that served as eyes, which she had been told by people who knew that you should never try to read them the way you read human eyes, because the information they conveyed was not emotion. She looked at them anyway. I sent a copy to a secure relay before I came here. If I don't confirm my status in, she checked the time on the cargo bay's wall clock. 40 minutes, it files automatically. Silence. She watched his exoskeleton. The amber deepened. You are one subject, he said. Your filing will delay this survey. It will not stop the program. No, she agreed. It won't. She kept her voice level. But it will make the program visible, and visible things are harder to do quietly. He moved. She had been told he was fast. She had told herself she understood what fast meant, but she had underestimated the speed of a Sarathi assessor in full resolution, which was not the speed of aggression but the speed of procedure, practiced until it was reflexive. He was across the space between them, before she had processed the decision to move. She moved anyway. Not because she could match him. She knew she couldn't match him. She moved because the point was not to win this exchange. The point was to occupy him for 39 more minutes, and she had spent her entire life learning to exist in spaces where she had no business existing, to make herself difficult to complete, to be, in the particular language of systems and ledgers, an open case. The first time he caught her, she used the service tunnel she'd mapped 3 days earlier, the one behind the east wall panel that she'd confirmed no Sarathi body plan could follow her through. The second time she used the cargo bay's freight rigging, which was not designed for climbing and would not have occurred to anyone who hadn't spent 2 years learning the structural grammar of every level on Kesavar 7. The third time she used something she'd learned from Seth, the thing he did with wire and 2 fingers and concentration, applied to the assessor's own processing station, which she'd studied carefully enough to know the one point in its self-contained armor where the lock mechanism had a gap. Not to destroy it. She didn't destroy it. She introduced an irregularity, small, reversible, the kind of thing that would require an assessor to stop and recheck his entire database before completing any further processing, to ensure the integrity of the certified records. She watched him stop. She watched him realize what she'd done. His exoskeleton went a color she had no name for past amber, into something that was almost red at the margins. And she understood this was the first time in 40 years of audits that an assessor Keth had been made to stop. You have introduced an error into certified records, he said. That is a Concord-level offense. File it, she said. 22 minutes. He came at her again. The next 10 minutes were the longest of her life, measured not in seconds, but in the incremental grammar of a body doing what it had been trained to do in a space it had memorized for exactly this purpose. The assessor was not simply fast. Fast was a word for things that moved quickly in straight lines. He was efficient, which was different. He moved the shortest path between himself and the objective, recalibrating continuously, without the hesitation of someone who had to decide whether to act. He had been completing audits for 40 years. His movements in this space had the terrible fluency of a practiced thing. She had 3 advantages, and she knew it. She was smaller, which meant she fit into spaces he didn't. She had memorized this specific level in a way he hadn't. And she had the very particular advantage of someone who had nothing to lose by trying things that seemed improbable. She'd spent her whole life trying improbable things because the probable ones had never been offered to her. The second time he caught her arm, the grip was hard enough that she felt the joint strain at the shoulder. She went with the grip instead of against it, tucked and rolled, using his momentum, came out of the roll 3 meters away with her shoulder singing and her feet under her. He had expected resistance. The compliance had cost him 2 seconds of recalibration. She was at the south wall panel before he reoriented. The service tunnel was exactly as she'd left it, dark, narrow, the smell of old wiring and recycled air. She went in on her elbows and knees, which was the only way to go in, because the tunnel was 40 centimeters wide at its narrowest, and she had measured the width of a Sarathi assessor's exoskeletal shoulder span at 1.3 meters. She had been measured for most of her life. She had learned to measure back. She heard him at the panel behind her. She heard, and felt through the tunnel structure, the vibration of him attempting to follow and stopping, the specific quality of a thing encountering an impossibility that had been deliberately constructed. She emerged from the tunnel on the far side into the secondary cargo bay. 18 minutes. She crossed to the assessor's processing station. She had been building to this from the beginning. This was the thing the tunnel had bought her time for, and she found the point she'd identified 3 days ago when she'd studied the unit through Durst's display surface. The lock mechanism's gap was exactly where she'd calculated it would be, because Sarathi engineering was precise and precise things had predictable tolerances, and she'd spent 2 years learning the tolerances of every system on Kesavar 7. Seth's wire, 2 fingers, concentration. The irregularity she introduced was small. She'd been precise about this, not destruction. It was an open question. The kind that required every certified entry in the system to be re-verified before any new certification could be processed, because the integrity chain had been interrupted, because integrity chains were only as strong as their weakest link, because she had spent her entire life as someone classified as a weak link, and she understood better than most people what a weak link could actually do. She stepped back. She watched the assessor enter the bay from the north door, having gone around. She watched him see what she'd done. His exoskeleton went a color she had no name for. The station beacon array was in the World's Fair Pavilion, the showpiece of Kesavar 7 commercial level, built to celebrate the station's centenary and never quite disassembled afterward, a 300-foot projection array that could light the surrounding space with a directional beam visible for half a sector. It had been lit for the survey delegation's arrival. It had been lit, Mara knew from 2 years of running these corridors, twice before that in her memory. It was lit now. Not the full array, 1 projector, the signal strength kind, aimed not outward into space but inward at the station's own communication relay. The signal it was broadcasting was not a commercial frequency. She was on the freight rigging 20 meters above the cargo floor when she saw it, a faint wash of directed light bleeding through the ventilation grating in the south wall, the particular color temperature of the pavilion projector. She understood what it meant before she worked out the logic. Wren had filed. The filing was transmitting. The 40-minute window had not quite elapsed, which meant he'd gone early, which meant. The assessor's processing station chimed. She watched Assessor Keth go still. The chime was a Concord Sector Court acknowledgement tone. She knew what it sounded like because she had heard it twice in her life on other people's devices, and once, just once, In a recording Wren had shown her of a previous filing in a previous sector. The one case in 40 years of surveys where a challenge had been mounted and failed, but mounted. The assessor stood at his processing station, and the chime continued, and his exoskeleton went from red amber to pale gray in the space of 3 seconds, and she understood from the gray that the gray was not calm. The gray was the color of a certainty being revised. She dropped from the freight rigging. She landed badly. She'd known she would. The height was wrong, and she hit the cargo floor rolling and came up with her left ankle protesting in a way that would need attention later. She didn't stop moving. She was at the station's service exit when she heard his voice behind her, still in perfect Concord standard, still with the grammar of someone who chose words like load-bearing components. "This will be challenged," he said. "The Concord process is long. The survey program has operated for 40 years, one filing." She stopped at the threshold. She turned around. He was standing in the center of the cargo bay, very still, his exoskeleton the pale gray of revised certainty, his optical structures aimed at her with the focused attention of a man encountering, for the first time in 40 years, a variable he hadn't accounted for. She was smaller than him by half. Her tusks were asymmetrical. Her lineage record was covered in slash marks. "One filing," she said, "becomes 2 filings, and then 11, and then the aggregate of 11 concurrent sectors with the processing data attached, and then it's not one challenge in 40 years, it's a pattern, and patterns are harder to close than cases." She held his gaze. "You know this. That's why you tried to complete me early." He was quiet. "The program will adapt," he said. "It will find other." "I know," she said. "I know it will." She said it without anger, without the heat she had expected to feel, because the heat had been transmuted somewhere in the past 40 minutes into something steadier and harder and more durable. "But it will have to do it visibly, and I'll be visible too." She left. She found Wren at the pavilion beacon, standing beside the projector with his hands at his sides, and the bruise on his jaw faded to something barely visible, and an expression she still didn't have full vocabulary for. Seth was there too, because Seth was always there, sitting on a cargo crate with his wire shape in his hands, looking up when she came through the entrance with the slightly uneven gait of a person walking on an ankle that was deciding how seriously to take the indignity. "Filed," Wren said. "I know I saw the light." He looked at her, he looked at her ankle. "You need." "Later," she said. "What happens now with the filing?" "Sector court will process. They'll request the assessor's records. He can't suppress them now that they're in a court queue." He paused. "It will take time. There will be challenges. The program has Concord members on its side." "But it's visible now." "Yes." She stood in the pavilion and looked at the beacon. The projection array had been built to celebrate what the station's founders had imagined as a new era, a Kesevar 7 at the crossroads of interstellar commerce, gleaming, prosperous, a light in the dark of the outer belt. Most of that had not come to pass. What had come to pass was messier and harder, and nothing like the promotional materials. But the light was still there. "The other flagged cases," she said. "At the other stations, can we reach them?" Wren was quiet for a moment, not quickly. "But eventually." "Oh, yes." Seth held up his wire shape. It was a small loop, she saw now, the skeleton key she'd taken from him the first night, reshaped into something else. Not a key anymore. Something more open-ended. She didn't know what it was supposed to be, but it had the quality of something unfinished in a direction rather than incomplete. "I never had a mother," she said. She said it plainly, the way she said most things without performing anything around it. "I never had a father. I had a number in a ledger with slash marks beside it." She looked at the beacon. "I thought for a long time that was the whole story." Neither of them spoke. "It isn't," she said. "It's the beginning of it." She took the wire shape from Seth's hands and looked at it. "We'll make something," she said. The words came out in the Vorech clan language, the one she'd never been fully taught but had absorbed by proximity, and then she said them again in Concord Standard for Wren's benefit. Something new, something better. The beacon burned. Somewhere in the sector court relay, 342 files were processing. Somewhere on 11 stations, 342 people who had woken up that morning as slash marks in a ledger were waking up as something else. She didn't know yet what that something else would be. She knew, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had been learning to survive in the gaps between what was allowed and what was necessary since before she could walk, that it would need to be built carefully, and that it would need people who were fluent in the language of those gaps, and that the work would be long and unfinished and worth doing anyway. She turned away from the beacon. She limped out of the pavilion into the corridor, Seth on her left, Wren on her right, the station noise of Kesevar 7 wrapping around them like it always had, the pressure cycles, the ventilation shifts, the ambient hum of a place that had never quite become what it promised, and was therefore honest in the way that only failed promises are honest. The ankle throbbed. She kept walking. Months later, in the Concord sector court proceedings, when the advocate assigned to her case asked her what had made her walk into the assessor's field station voluntarily, she paused for a long time before answering. The advocate was human, young, patient in the careful way of someone who understood that patience was a tool. He had a habit of turning a stylus over in his fingers when he was waiting for an answer, and the motion reminded her of something she put away before she identified it. "I had 3 options," she said finally in Concord Standard with the precision she had learned to apply to formal contexts. "I could run, I could wait, or I could make myself impossible to complete quietly. And you chose the third." "I chose the third." He turned the stylus. "Why?" She thought about the ventilation shaft and the pale orc newborns in the pen who had not made it to their 30th day. She thought about Durst's voice and the ambient, general cruelty of people who don't think of you as a person. She thought about Seth's bent wire and the beacon's cold light and Wren's bruised jaw and the particular quality of focus that came from having a debt rather than a purpose, and how she had watched that quality in him change over the weeks of their work together, shift from debt into something she still didn't have a full word for, something that had to do with the difference between surviving and being capable of more than survival. She thought about the slash marks. "Because running," she said, "is just walking toward the same wall from a longer distance." The advocate wrote something down. Outside the court chamber's single viewport, the outer belt drifted the gray-silver of old rock, the faint light scatter of distant systems, the dark between them as absolute and patient, and full of ungiven things as it had always been. She had been born into that dark. She was still here. The case continued. The Concord sector court proceedings lasted 11 months. Mara attended every session, which was not required but which she had decided, early in the process, was necessary in the particular way that presence was sometimes necessary, not for the information it conveyed but for the fact of itself. She sat in the observer's gallery of the sector court chamber on Thurvian Station, which was larger and cleaner and better lit than anywhere she had ever been before, and she watched the legal machinery work through the evidence with the slow, grinding patience of institutional processes that had been designed, at some level, to outlast the things that challenged them. Stanek's biometric records were, as he had predicted, the load-bearing element. The survey processing data she had pulled from the relay junction provided the pattern. The biometric baseline data provided the individuals, 342 of them, each with a name, each with a body that had been documented under Concord health protocols, each now existing in the court record as something other than a processing notation. The legal team Wren had assembled 3 humans, one species she didn't have a name for yet, working out of a small office on the court station's commercial level, argued the case in the dense, specific language of Concord documentation law, and she listened to every word, not because she understood all of it yet, but because she was learning, and learning required proximity. The compliance officers from Bullock's team were removed from their positions in the third month. Quietly, through internal Concord processes, the kind of removal that happened without announcement. She had been told to view this as a victory, and she did, provisionally, with the caveat that she had learned early to be suspicious of quiet victories. Assessor Keth submitted his response to the court in the 5th month. It was long, precise, and written in the same perfect Concord standard he used for everything. He did not deny the facts. He argued context of 40 years of program operation, Concord-level authorization, the proper legal standing of population health management as a sanctioned survey function. He used the words optimization and genetic coherence with the same care he used all words. His response was, in its way, more honest than she had expected. He believed what he had written. That was the thing she had understood in the cargo bay, watching his exoskeleton go gray, and she had not stopped understanding it since, that the program's worst quality was not its cruelty but its sincerity. Cruelty at least knew what it was. The court ruled in the 6th month on the procedural question, the one that mattered most immediately, that the survey program in the Thurvian sector was suspended pending full evidentiary review. Not ended, suspended. She had been told this was significant. She understood that it was significant. She also understood it was not the wall. The wall was still there. She had always known the wall was still there. In the 7th month, a filing came in from Kesavar 3, 2 stations down the outer belt. Then 1 from the Morven cluster. Then 3 from the Delvith system, which was 2 sectors away and which she had not known was under concurrent audit, which meant the 11 surveys she had counted were 11 she could count, not 11 total. The filings came in with attached data, biometric records, processing files, names. Each one built on the framework that the Thurvian case had established, using the same legal category, the same evidentiary structure, the same argument about visibility that she had made to the assessor in the cargo bay with her ankle beginning to protest, and the beacon light bleeding through the ventilation grating. Wren brought her the notification of the 3rd filing on a morning when she was sitting in the court station food hall, eating something warm and unremarkable with Seth, who had been given provisional Concord protective status under the case umbrella and was writing another letter to his sister. She read the notification. She set it down. Seth looked up. Good. 3 so far, she said. He went back to the letter. He was writing it by hand, which was slower but which he said felt more real, more like something that would arrive rather than something that would transmit. She didn't know if his sister had ever responded to the letters. She hadn't asked. Some things were better approached from the side. She looked out the viewport. The station here was at a different position in the Thurvian system, closer in, with better light, and the outer belt was visible as a pale line rather than an immediate surrounding, a stripe of gray-silver against the darker background of deep space. She could see, if she looked for it, the approximate direction of Kesavar 7. She had not been back since the night of the beacon. She didn't know if she would go back. She knew that Durst had reorganized his operations, quietly, practically, in the way of a man who had received information about the direction of the wind and adjusted his sails accordingly. She knew that the 3 orphans, Dicky, and the other 2 whose names she had learned eventually, had been placed in provisional housing under Concord protective status. She knew that Stanek was still there, still running his medical-adjacent services, and that he had added the sector court filing support to his list of things he did when no one was officially watching. She thought about the station sometimes, the ventilation shafts, the smell of machine oil and recycled air and Durst's cheap transit-grade coffee. The quality of silence at deep shift, when the pressure cycles ran at minimum, and you could hear, if you were quiet enough, the faint structural language of the station's bones, the metal stress sounds, the the thermal expansion creaks, the whole long conversation that a thing made by human hands had with the physics of the space it occupied. She had been a slash mark in that place. A small impure thing with asymmetrical tusks and a lineage record full of notations that meant less than. She was still small. She was still asymmetrical. She still had no lineage record that was worth anything in the Vorech clan's accounting. But she was in the court record now, under her full name, Mara, case identifier 7 Vorech, complainant. And the case number was linked to 342 other case identifiers, and those were linked to the filings from Kesavar 3 and Morven and Delveth, and those were linked to the legal framework that Wren's team had built, which was itself linked to the biometric record Stanek had kept for 11 years in the particular stubborn way of a man who had decided that keeping records was the one thing he could do that might eventually matter. It was not, she knew, the whole story. It was the beginning of it. And beginnings, she had found, required specific things. A visible presence, a record that survived the attempt to suppress it, and the particular kind of stubbornness that came from having been classified as less than for long enough that you had nothing left to lose from disagreeing. Seth folded his letter. He held it for a moment, looking at it with the expression of someone deciding something. "I never ask," he said, "because I never know if it's—" He paused, unfolded the letter partially, folded it again. "Does it bother you that they'll fight it, that it won't be finished?" She thought about the slash marks. She thought about the orc newborns in the pen who had not made it. She thought about the assessor's exoskeleton going gray, and what she had known in that moment, not triumph, not relief, but the specific quality of a door being opened that had previously appeared to be a wall. "Yes," she said, "it bothers me." He nodded. "But being bothered," she said, "is different from being stopped." She picked up the notification of the third filing and read it again, carefully, the way she read everything, looking for the gaps, the tolerances, the places where the mechanism had a point of entry that wasn't obvious from the outside. There was always a point of entry. She had learned this before she could walk. The advocate's stylus, Seth's wire, the smell of the ventilation shaft, the beacon burning. The case continued. And so did she.